Welcome back to the Midweek Bible Study, and we are in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 27. And it may seem odd that the rest of the world is in Advent season, and so are we on Sundays and on Mondays. But since we started this journey, we've tried very hard to never interrupt it. So the Just Jesus stories continue. They will finish up Matthew next week, and then we will enter the new year with a new book, the book of John. And then we'll decide where we go from there. And that will have a lot to do with you. I've had some folk that have asked me to go through the Old Testament as we've done the New over the last few years. And that is in the order in which it is written. It's actually a lot more difficult to do that with the Old Testament because the books were written and then rewritten and edited. And therefore, parts of the books are literally hundreds of years different age than another part of the book. So we'll have a look. We might be able to go book by book and talk about how they were written, but we won't be able to go verse by verse like we've done through the New Testament, because that would probably take us, I'm not exaggerating here, 10 to 12 years. And I'm not sure if I'm going to be around for 10 or 12 years, but I'll work as long as I'm here. How's that? So send in your suggestions to info@oursafeharbor.com. All right? Matthew 27:27, we're in a very grim section, right in the middle of the pre-trials, the trials. Now Christ has been handed over for crucifixion, which was a whole thing. The Romans had the torture, humiliation, shaming, terrorism thing down pat. It was a science to them. They did it every day. And they had people whose job it was to do it, and to do it with maximum pain and maximum shame. So that's where we are, all right? In Matthew chapter 27 and verse 27, then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. Then they twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand and knelt in front of him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Then they spit on him. They took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they'd mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. This was an integral part of the crucifixion. The shaming, the beating, the removal of the prisoner's will. And that it's a torture technique which some nations still employ. You have to break the will to where there will be no resistance, because there's going to be great resistance to someone lying down on a cross and getting nailed to it unless you have pre-broken them. And these soldiers had no other entertainment. This is what they did. And it was also, they hated the Jews. They hated anyone who was not a Roman. Now, most of them weren't Roman citizens, but they had certain special rights as Roman soldiers. So they considered themselves well above the Jews or any other subject peoples. They mock, they hit him with the staff. These things we see on television all the time. Somebody gets just clocked, just a fist to the face. And the next scene, they might have a little bruise there. Friends, if you've ever seen somebody truly beaten up, you don't recognize them for a while, and their eyes and nose and mouth and jaw may never look okay again. There'll be enough off even after operations that you know that a traffic accident or something has happened to these people. By the time Jesus was done with all of this, he would have had a very hard time seeing. His eyes would have been nearly shut. He would have lost some teeth. His nose would have been broken. There would have been blood coming, perhaps even out of his ears, which is a sign of some pretty serious brain damage as well. That was the norm. That's what they did to people. As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they offered Jesus wine to drink, mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it. Why did they have somebody else carry the cross? We cannot say with any certainty, but most likely it is because Jesus was unable to carry his own cross at the first. We know that later he took it back, but he was hurt. He was malnourished. He was dehydrated. He was broken, and to speed things along, because you didn't want to. This was an art to the Romans. You wanted to terrify the people, but if you went too long, then you could have a backlash in the streets, getting from one place to the place of crucifixion. So you had to carefully gauge how far you could push things. And while they might have thought it funny that Jesus couldn't pick up his cross or find the street or know where he was, if that's what happened, they would have understood that to linger in those narrow passages was not tactically sound. So they grabbed a guy and they had him carry it for a while. And then what's with the vinegar mixed with gall? It was a wine mixed with gall, rather. It was a primitive sedative. Now, I'm pretty sure it would have tasted absolutely horrid, but Jesus turned it away not because it was tasted bad, but because he was going to take the pain. He'd asked his Father in the garden, if you remember, let this cup pass from me, but nevertheless thy will, not mine, be done. So again, we brought up the word cup there means sufferings and trials. Since God didn't remove it, he took it. And there's a thing, people will often ask, well, why did Jesus have to be crucified? And that's a very fair question. And there are a lot of depths to the answer. But the short answer is, Jesus gave everything, and there's no way we can look at him and go, well, he didn't give everything. If he'd been on medications, we might have been able to pull that off and say, well, he was medicated through the pain, and I'm living through pain that medicine doesn't take. He didn't. He took it. He took it all. When they'd crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. Why would you do that? Well, because cloth was hard to get. And even the cloth of a peasant from Judea that had been sweated through and probably had blood on it, I think they stripped him before they did most of the damage to him, but we have no way of knowing. Even that was precious enough to take. You couldn't go down to the shop to get more, and on your wages you were likely limited to the one pair of clothes that you had. And so any cloth that you got was money, and it was gift and the money, and it was valuable. And so they, instead of just one person grabbing it, they divided it with lots, and sitting down, they kept watch over him there. Now, just I know that little kids may be in the car, and so we're not going to scare them at all. Just be aware that crucifixions did not take place up high like you see in the paintings. Feet would have been no more than a couple of feet above the ground, very often just inches above the ground. And that way you could be face to face with the terror and the horror. But you could also, if you were that kind of person, you could get into their face and spit on them and yell at them and mock them. Very much like early Americans did, I think before you could really call it America, when they put people in the stocks in the New England states, when somebody had gone to sleep in church or they had been with the wrong person. And so you put them in stocks, and very, very uncomfortable, very painful. And part of the punishment was everybody would come around and throw stuff at you and laugh at you. And you had to take it because you were locked into the stocks. It's very much the same. Human beings have not gotten all that much better. While we don't do this to people in America, we do our level best to crucify them mentally, occupationally, financially, but we just call it cancel culture or attacks on social media. And so people get fired, people get ruined, marriages break up. So people do it that way. It's still the mocker's circle out there. Make sure that you're never a part of it. Above his head, they placed the written charge against him. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. I find that fascinating that Pilate had it written to be placed there. The Jewish leaders, remember, we are not condemning all Jews here. The Jewish leadership objected to that, said you should write, he called himself King of the Jews. But Pilate needed a charge. Now, it's not so much that he had to justify everybody he crucified, because Rome, quite frankly, couldn't care less. but to cover his rear end, which is what sub-governors type people in Rome always had to do. He put Jesus, King of the Jews, not as a declaration of who Jesus was, but as the charge. He called himself a king, in other words, therefore he was a danger to the peace of Rome, and therefore he had to be removed. That's why it's called a charge here rather than just a sign. 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it up in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you're the Son of God." Again, people, being very dark, evil. Don't be surprised. It's out there in vast quantities. Every nation that needs those kind of people finds those kind of people very quick. In fact, they line up around the block to enforce anything against their neighbors. It is a tragedy, but it's one of the reasons why we need Jesus. I would also say that, at least in my view, this would be an incredible temptation. We have all kind of superheroes. Now, I'm not a superhero movie type person, whether Marvel or DC or any other kind, because physics gets in the way, but also because I realize what it's really doing. The first Wonder Woman movie, for example, was actually very well done because it showed some philosophical issues that really superhero movies solve for us. She was the God that we wanted. Because remember, she saw World War I and all the butchery, and she said, "Why would you do this to each other?" And we have that question, don't we? We say, why do we do this, and why would God let this happen? And so a superhero comes along with the power to stop it, and they stop it. And that's the kind of God we want. A superhero would have come off the cross. A superhero would have absolutely beaten up, thrown away, shamed somehow all of the mockers. The superhero would have flown to Rome and walked in and kicked the emperor. And in doing so, they would have saved themselves. But they would condemn the rest of the world, because Jesus had to die to defeat death and resurrect so that we no longer have death as an enemy. Sin is forgiven, death is gone. If he saved himself the way a superhero would, then he would have killed us all. So Jesus took it. In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the elders mocked him. He saved others, they said, but he cannot save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. By the way, I don't think so. I don't think they would believe in him, even if in their hearts they believed in him, because that would make them lose their power and position, and people will do anything to keep their power. But they go on, he trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him, for he said, "I am the Son of God." Now they've ratcheted it up. They can't get to him directly. Now they're going to get to him through his claiming to be the Son of God, saying, "All right, God, if you like him, bring him off." So now who are they challenging? The Father. And the Father could have acted. He could have acted. Sorry, I'm getting my tenses wrong today. He could have acted. He could have moved. As the old song says, he could have sent 10,000 angels. Jesus said legions of angels. The psalmist tells us that as well. But he didn't. Why? Because he would have doomed us for petty revenge against a bunch of people that most of you will never even know their names. And in fact, Caiaphas was among these. And while some archaeologists dispute the authenticity of it, many others have examined it and accept it. There is an ossuary, a bone box that was found in construction. I don't know, this has got to be 20 plus years ago now. Should have looked that up, shouldn't I? An ivory bone box. And what those were was when a wealthy family was buried, they were buried generally in caves on shelves. And then after a while, you'd run out of room. And so when a new body came in, you'd take the oldest body and you'd put those bones in a box and give the new guy the shelf. Well, there was an ossuary, and the ossuary said, the family of Caiaphas, high priest. We have his bones. Jesus' bones aren't on the earth. Jesus could have leapt off the cross, or God could have taken petty revenge on Caiaphas, struck him down in front of everyone, or somehow humiliated him to where he cried for pity and the like. That's what you'd expect in superheroes or movies about the gods. But he didn't, because had he done so, he would have condemned us all. This had to be seen through. In the same way, the robbers who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness came upon all the land. That would mean from 9 in the morning till about noon. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Comes right out of the Psalms, Psalm 22, verse 1. Was Jesus just quoting the Psalm? Not just quoting. He used the Psalm for his words. For example, I have the Episcopalian Book of Common Prayer. I have a couple of other prayer groups, books as well. They give me words. They give me words that I can use in prayer. The Psalms give me words and prayers. Songs give me words I can use in prayer. Because I'm just not very mellifluous, very full of the right words in prayer. And I need words to express what I'm feeling, so I go get words. Jesus' despair is so great at this point that he quotes the psalmist, where are you, God? Why have you left me? And the heartache here. I don't think I need to drum that in to anybody here. I don't think I need to make you morose and drive you to tears. This is a fact. These are stories that already take us there. If you're wondering, did God really forsake him? No. But when it feels like that, doesn't it? Many of us have experienced that feeling. And we cry out. Are we wrong to cry out to God, why have you forsaken me? No. The psalmist did, and his son did. It is a reaction of ours to what we feel, what looks real to us, and what really is all too real to us. When some of those standing there heard this, he said, he's calling Elijah. Remember, he said, Eloi, Eloi. They were thinking he said Elijah. How could you confuse those two? Easy. Remember, broken nose, swollen face, missing teeth, dehydration. What he said was hard to understand. Therefore, they're going, okay, he's calling Elijah. Now, they thought Elijah was going to come back before the Messiah, so that was pretty exciting to them. Immediately, one of them ran, got a sponge, filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offers it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, now, leave him alone. They want his mouth loosened up a bit so he can say some more. If he can call Elijah, let him call Elijah. They said, leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him. It seems incredibly callous and cruel, doesn't it? Instead of saying, this poor man's hurting, to say, well, let's see what happens next. In these days, life was so short, nasty, brutish, and short, as a poet said, that people didn't respond the same way that we might think we would have at the time. You wouldn't have. You would have been just like them, because there's something called chronological arrogance. And that says, if I lived at that time, I would have reacted different than they. No. If you lived at that time, you would have had all the cultural experiences and all the cultural attitudes and assumptions that they did. You would not be an advanced progressive figure from the year 2024, soon to be 2025, back then. You'd be one of them. So while we can be aghast at their behavior, let us not be so arrogant as to think ours would differ. Then Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, and he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split. What's going on there? Well, at this time of day, on this day, people would have been gathered around the temple. The sun, having just passed the hour of 3, is now beginning to set and is shining in on a curtain. Now, that curtain separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies, where the high priest could only go once a year. And no, he didn't have a rope tied to his ankle to pull him out in case he died. That's a medieval myth. It's amazing how many people still teach that as if it's scripture or history. But he would go in and pray and offer for the sins of the people once a year in there with the Ark of the Covenant, which had been missing by this time for many hundreds of years, never to be recovered. Sorry, Indiana Jones didn't find it either. In fact, Indiana Jones had zero effect on anything that happened in that movie. If you go back and look at it, it's kind of fascinating and a little disheartening. Anyway, the people would have been staring as the sun lit up that cloth. And generally, in most periods of history, there would have been a great cheer as the Son of God, the light, hits that curtain. And God, with invisible hands, rips it, top to bottom. God has separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place and from the common people for a long time. But now he has ripped it open. Humans now have access to the Holy of Holies through Christ. But also, he was going to end their celebration. He was going to end their little party. That was not going to be, there's not going to be a party today. God, can you say he was angry? I would think this is anger. The way he darkened the sky, I often wonder if that was a poetic way of saying he couldn't even look. He couldn't even look. And maybe that's overstating it, because frankly, we don't know. But it's certainly something to think about if it was your child. Then Matthew talks about something which we've had a question about recently, and you may have heard the response, but here we go. The tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs, and after Jesus' resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Now that got my attention when I was a young man reading this, going, well, that would have caused quite the commotion. Formerly dead people now walking around the city. But there's a real problem here. Matthew's the only one who says anything about it, and this is all he says. There's never any follow-up. No names, no examples of meetings, no here's what the effect was. Nobody ever refers back to it. Not Paul, not Peter, not John, not Luke. Nobody does. And there's nothing in any historical record that indicates this ever happened. This could be an interpolation. In other words, a writer puts that in later on. It could be Matthew heard that and put it in. But we must admit there is zero other mention of this. There are no prophecies about this. There's no backup saying, here's what happened when these dead people showed up in the streets. And again, they're never used in theology, never made them use a point, never raised again. And that makes it very much an outlier. And so when people ask me to tell them more about that, the end, I cannot. Because there is nothing more I can say. Moving on, when the centurion and those who were with him, who were guarding Jesus, saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." Now there are other manuscripts, and you look at all of them, and it is not at all clear whether he said the Son of God or a Son of God. So there was a great Hollywood movie made where, called The Robe. And it's certainly worth watching. It's an old movie, so you'll have to go back, but somebody's streaming it. And the centurion then becomes a Christian, and it becomes this great, great story. And there were a lot of stories like that about the soldiers who crucified Jesus in early Christian literature and in medieval writings. None of it's in history, none of it's in scripture. So it probably didn't happen. But the centurion saw enough around him going, God is angry, or a God is angry. This must have been a Son of God. That's rather impressive. Many women were there watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's son. As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph of Arimathea has a lot of early stories about him as well that are maybe myth, maybe a tinge of history. The story is that he was a very, very wealthy man. We know that from scripture, but that he made his money going back and forth to what we would now call Cornwall, the southwest of England, in tin mines. That was a very big thing back then, and importing this into Rome. A very early story also says that Jesus, as a young boy, went with him, and the English still have hymns that talk about when Jesus walked upon their soil. Is it likely? I would say no, but sure is a good story, and I like good stories even if they're not likely. So we don't know, but we do know that he was brave enough to come up and to Pilate and ask for the body. I don't think he was risking his life doing this. Pilate did not seem to consider Jesus a great enemy. He was just doing this to please the people and get the peace back. And to get rid of the body sounds good too, so take it. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in clean linen cloth, placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. And we're going to stop there because next week's going to be short too. And because we don't want to start a new book on Christmas Day. All right? So